Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm Peter Lavelle. On this edition of The Gaggle, we're going to discuss the culture wars. As a matter of fact, on The Gaggle, we're going to discuss this all through the week and next week because it is a fascinating topic, and ultimately, in my opinion, it is a very destructive phenomenon. Joining us is Philip Giraldi. He's a former CIA counter-terrorism specialist, and of course, we have George Samueli. He's a co-founder of this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us, Phil, here. You've written recently about the culture war. How did this really come about? Because I'll give a spoiler right now. For me, it's very little about ideology. It's all about power. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I would go beyond that. Power is, as reflected in politics, is really, I think, what it's all about. We have two major parties that are divided by a great wall, and ideologically speaking, and they're both jockeying for the kinds of issues, or to control the kinds of issues that they think will get them elected and give them a majority in November. So I think that's what we're seeing play out. But there's also a lot of stupidity that goes into it, because there's a lot of pandering to various interest groups that the two sides see as their constituencies, and the constituencies are miles apart in terms of what might be called American culture, American history, what America is all about. And in that sense, this is an important election coming up. And as it seems that the numbers are drawing closer, and there's a high possibility or even probability that it's going to be the kind of election that can be disputed, the cultural issues are really important in how this plays out.
Philip, could I just ask you, would you say that the culture wars are really a substitute for actual political conflict, right? The actual issues that used to divide the political parties, where you had the pro-business Republican Party and the pro-organized labor Democratic Party. So now we get these fights over gun control, abortion, school prayer, so but not really about the issues that really are the most important to people, which is the bread and butter issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, because I think you're exactly right. A lot of these issues are secondary issues, where, for example, gun rights are not going to go away. America's role as an interventionist, militarist foreign policy is not going to go away. Neither party has been attacking that in any serious way. Other issues that you would think would be front and center as important to the American people, given the pandemic that we're going through, like national health care, is not even on the table for anyone.
During a pandemic.
Yeah. So it's quite amazing. I think these are kinds of substitute issues that are being fought over. There is indeed a large divide between what I would call a conservative national view, which is very often tied in with people who are religious, people who are living in rural areas. There's no question they have a certain perspective, and people in the cities very often have a different perspective, and minorities in the country will have a perspective of their own. But the fact is, I don't think that what's driving this is really serious issue driven. These are all pretexts that are being used by politicians to create their own constituencies, to create a majority in the upcoming election.
Yeah, but for me, George touched on it. It seems to me that this is just a cover not to talk about gross inequality in America. And, it's not said very often, but it's very true. There's a lot of poor white people, too, in America. It's more of a class issue. And the liberals and a lot of conservatives, because the libertarians have just invaded the GOP, which I think is a disaster. And on the left, they don't want to talk about it because they want to build their coalitions based on gender, the color of your skin, how oppressed you are, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me it's very convenient for the continuum, the political continuum of not to talk about gross inequality, because it's only getting worse. Okay, it's the neoliberals and it's the Chamber of Commerce. Neither want to talk about the everyday people, working people in America. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think Americans and people in many countries now have forgotten why you create a government in the first place.
Exactly.
My belief is that, if you go back to the ancient Greeks and maybe even before that, the idea was that a government is supposed to create a situation that provides equality under law and fairness in terms of how it deals with the people that live in that country. And you see that repeatedly in the founders of the United States and the discussions for the Constitution, that this was the objective. It wasn't an objective to create incentives for certain groups to have things that other groups don't have. That was not part of the Constitution. And it was, and so it's just a question of what is government supposed to do? Unlike a libertarian, I would argue again that things like national health care have clearly become what should be a good thing that government would be doing for the people. And the fact that people get into debates over the ideology of these issues doesn't take that away. The fact is, there are things we all recognize as being important, and equality under law. I mean, if Black people are being discriminated against by certain aspects of the legal system, well, let's look at it and let's demonstrate it and see what we can do to fix it. Most people would support that.
But that's just going back to that. What's interesting, though, is that government in the United States, anyway, has in a way abdicated that very role of achieving equality, and it has been thrown into the arms of the courts. So while we can have discussions about, for instance, racial equality, but those are issues that are actually dealt with by the courts. I mean, these are all court rulings stemming from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and therefore everything is pretty much settled by them. So therefore, when politicians argue about these things, there's not a whole lot that they can do about it. It's actually a matter that is decided by the courts. So it's again a odd kind of thing that politicians argue about things that they really don't have too much control over.
Yes, and if I could just interject here, and you have the courts now intensely politicized as a result. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make, that the courts are politicized. And besides, who makes the laws that the courts then interpret? These highly politicized courts then interpret. It's the politicians. It's the legislatures in all these states. It's the legislature in Congress. They make the laws. So they basically do set the guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. But if you think about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it's really very difficult to believe that the architects of that law really had an understanding of how far-reaching it would become, how the courts interpreted it and gave it, pushed it into all sorts of directions. So yes, the legislator did it, but the politicians who were debating it at the time in 1964 really had no idea how drastic this piece of legislation would be.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. And as we just both mentioned, Peter and I, the courts are heavily politicized. So obviously the fact that they're politicized has been driving the process of interpreting the Civil Rights Act and other legislation in a way that is they are comfortable with. There was a news story about 2 days ago where the district attorney in San Francisco has decided that she is not going to prosecute any looters who can testify that they needed the thing that they stole. Now, what kind of interpretation of law, what kind of interpretation can I put on that in a country in which we allegedly have a rule of law where the government is at least one of its objectives is to secure my person and my property. Now, so we have someone completely, coming from the left position on this with a ridiculous judgment, but that's going to be what prevails in San Francisco.
Yeah, they want to, you know, I hear this from people, they want to tear up the Constitution and rewrite it. My response would be, why don't you read the Federalist Papers? And then you'll have an admiration for it's really one of the greatest documents of all time. If you look at the Federalist Papers and how it was thought about here, and people are willing just to throw it out wholesale. I want to stay with the topic with the culture wars. One of the things, I lived in Eastern Europe during communism, and one of the most important things that authoritarians do is they control your use of language. And this is happening to us now, saying what words mean. And I always push back and say, no, I'm going to use my understanding of the word. I'm not going to adopt yours, because once you genuflect to someone else's political lexicon and their interpretation, you become powerless. And this is what all these cultural wars are doing. Phil.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most serious issues that we're only starting to look at, which is essentially how we're getting a lot of hate legislation, we're getting censorship on the internet, we're getting censorship just about everywhere. And a lot of the censorship is to condition the language so that it conditions what people are free to think and what they're free to say. So this is a major issue, and of course it's probably even worse in Western Europe. In terms of what is acceptable speech and what is not acceptable speech. So this is fundamental, and it's a fundamental right. And you know, if you went to any of these countries, they would tell you, well, of course we have free speech, but no, you don't. You have conditioned
particularly
speech.
the case now with the enormous power of high tech. If you're off Facebook, you're off Twitter, you're done. You know, no one's going to hear you. So you know that's the end of your voice. And so it's really, you know, yes, we have free speech, but you're really at the mercy of who are these young kids at Twitter who decides that, oh, this is hate speech, you're off. And you know, this now happens to, you know, it's not Alex Jones, it's just about anybody can be just thrown off.
One of the things that's happened, and it's very much against the Anglo-Saxon tradition, is that we have never, in our tradition, we don't have prescribed speech. Now, we can all agree on certain things you shouldn't say. And it's almost universal, okay? But prescribed speech, what you're supposed to say, is something very new in our tradition. And that's why I find it very, very threatening, because we can come to an agreement on what's probably not appropriate to say in public. But now you're going to tell a very thin group of people, very narrow group of people are going to tell me, Facebook and Twitter, what I have to say. This is something alien to our tradition, and it's a threat to our tradition. Phil.
Yeah, I agree that that's happening all across the board, and it's happening in particular in the education system in the United States, where acceptable speech is very much the mode. Textbooks are being written to reflect the fact that there are certain viewpoints and certain things that one must never talk about. And as I'm following very closely the rioting going on in the United States, if you read the Washington Post, New York Times, any major newspaper, you notice after a while it's all the same language they use in describing the events that take place, even if the way they're describing it is diametrically opposed to other visual evidence. They have an accepted way they have to talk about it.
Mostly,
it's
like you mostly peace.
Yeah, but I remember when I was living in communist Eastern Europe, my friends would teach me how to read the news, how to read between the lines. We don't have that in the West. Okay, we don't have that in the U.S. You know, I mean, I think maybe the three of us could probably parse through things, but under authoritarian regimes, people learned that it was a reflex. It was something they understood. In the U.S., it's not the case. Philip, finish up 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think, you know, what is happening here. You know, we're at a kind of a stage. I keep thinking of Chairman Mao and his destruction of Chinese culture and civilization as a way of creating the new Chinese man. I think that's what a lot of these characters on the left are trying to do. And of course, people on the right have their own problem, which is essentially they're trying to maintain a reality which always had clay feet.
On that point, that we see the growth of an authoritarian mindset. Phil, thanks, and George, thanks. And please watch our next video on culture wars. Like, share, and subscribe.
Thank you.